In this video, I want to talk about basil. So if you're new to gardening, or you're thinking about gardening, or if you've even been a gardener for a long time and you don't know a lot about this herb, y'all sit back, relax, grab some paper and pen. Let's talk about basil, my favorite herb. So this is an herb that I know a lot about. I've been growing this herb for 4 years, and I've been on YouTube for 3. This is a fantastic herb, whether you're going to use it in pestos or in the kitchen or just as a companion plant out here in the garden, which we will go over at the end of this video. So first things first, how do you want to plant your basil? Do you want to get them from starts from like the big box stores, or do you want to plant from seed? Now, I've done both. I've had success with both, but I've had more success from getting basil from a big box store and then just transplanting it into the garden. And the main reason for that is basil can be tricky to grow from seed. I like to have a lot of varieties of plants out here and herbs, and basil has a lot of varieties, but you're only going to get the basic culinary ones at the big box stores. So if you want a variety of basil in your garden, then you will need to order seeds from a company. Now, I get all my seeds from Baker Creek, from rareseeds.com. I am not affiliated with them. It's just I believe in their product. It's that simple. I have basil right now that I'm looking at that you can only get if you grow them from seed. So what is the trick in growing them from seed? To be completely honest, my success in growing this herb from seed is really simple. I put them in the garden in good soil, and I make sure that I keep them watered. Once they start to sprout, y'all, it's off to the races. But if you are new to gardening, or you're new to this herb, I advise you to start with transplants from, say, the big box stores or your nurseries. Get them in your garden and then go from there. You can start planting your basil anytime where the soil temperature is above 50. Whether you're doing that from seed or from transplants, the target temperature for your soil should be about 50 degrees. Now, one thing I want to say real quick, if you are going to grow your basil from seed, you can always start them in seed trays, but I like to also just test and experiment and see what will work and what won't work. I had success in all these different directions. So I advise you, if you're going to go down the basil route, make sure you're experimenting, trying different ways, see what works best for you. Try different varieties once you get comfortable with the basic ones. Okay, now basil, just like any other herb or plant, for the most part, needs a good, rich, well-draining soil. The roots of this plant do not want to sit in soppy, swampy water. They want a moist soil that they can grow in. Now, as I'm showing you right here, basil gets big and it takes over. All basil right here. Now, this basil is growing really well because I've got it in very good soil. I've been planting this basil, like I said, for 4 years. So I'm to the point now that once they start to grow flowers, I leave them alone and I just allow the bees to come in, because basil is a fantastic plant for bringing in the pollinators. Fantastic, which we'll go over more here in just a minute. Okay, now I mentioned some different types of basil. There's lemon basil, cinnamon basil, purple basil, blue basil, just the regular culinary basil. There's basil, Peruvian basil, just all kinds of basils. Cardinal basil, which is actually my favorite. Now, if you are going to go down the route of making your own pestos, my advice is to have 2, 3, 4 plants that are just for your pesto harvests, not for letting them go to flower. Once a basil plant goes to flower, y'all, it's going to start, the leaves are going to start to get bitter. So if you are growing your basil for culinary purposes, you do not want your basil to bolt or flower, which is really easy to, the center stem, you just pick that center stem off the top and it'll slow down the flowering process. But if you're going to do what I do for the most part, and I just let the basil go to flower for the pollinators and for the companion planting aspect, which again we'll get into here shortly, you just let them go. And you can, right now as I'm looking right there, I see 15 bees, 10 bees, 10, 15 bees right there. You know what, I'll just show you. Look at all the bees flying around all that basil, y'all. They're just everywhere. And that, to me, is the biggest benefit to have. That's the second biggest benefit to having basil in your garden. I'll go over the first one here in a minute. Okay, planting basil. Now, if you're going to start it from seed, 6 to 8 weeks before your last expected frost date is when you should start your basil inside on the heat mats, under the grow lights, in the seed trays. If you're going to get them from transplants, or you're going to plant them from transplants, the big box stores usually start to sell them around the beginning of spring or your area's last expected frost date. So you can go get your basil, get them planted, and get rocking and rolling. Now, the benefit of transplants is they're already growing. Makes sense. If you're going to start them from seed, then you just have to back up the calendar. So for me, here in zone 9A, north of Houston, my last expected frost date is always about March 1st. So then I would count backwards 6 to 8 weeks, and then that's when I start planting all of my seeds that for all the different types of crops that I'm going to plant in spring inside all my heat mats under my grow lights. That's how you plant accordingly. You just count back from your last expected frost date. Now, once you get them in the ground, you want about 6 to 8 hours of full sun. Now, that's in the spring. This crop, from what I have learned and what I've witnessed, it handles my summers here, like in zone 9A, where we get triple digits for months at a time, 110, 107, hundreds. They handle them just fine. So once your plants are established, you really don't have to worry about them, at least not in the heat that I'm dealing with. And I'm also dealing with a lot of humidity. So the plants do great. But in the springtime, or right when you start to get them planted, 6 to 8 hours of full sun is what they need. And make sure, again, well draining, rich, nutritious soil. Plenty of compost all around. Give your plants that extra boost. Mosquitoes are getting me, y'all. Give your plants that extra boost just to get going, but well draining. Like, very, very important. Now, I did mention the soil being about 50 degrees. Between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees Fahrenheit is where you want your soil temps to be. Basil needs heat. Without the heat, they're not going to grow, or they're going to grow very, very slow. But once that heat kicks in, y'all, they take off. They gone. If you're going to sow your seeds directly into the ground, here's what I do. I'll take the seeds, I'll sprinkle them wherever I want them, and then I'll put about 1/4-ish of soil on top of them. That's after I've watered them in. And then I'll water in that soil that's on top. I leave them alone. From then on, I just keep the area watered. And I've literally, if you look behind me, you see all the basil out here. I mean, it's everywhere. I've had no trouble at all growing basil that way. You also want to give the basil plenty of space to grow. I like to put my basil along the borders of my beds, like I've done in these cinder block beds right here. As you can see, the basil is just going crazy, doing fantastic. It's late September, and this bed right here during the spring is my indeterminate tomato bed. Right now I have okra growing in them, but this basil does fantastic, no issues at all, period. But the key is, again, the soil, watering, and spacing, and then that sun. You definitely want the sun on your basil plants. Now let me show you my favorite basil plant. This is the cardinal basil. And the reason for it is just, well, look at how beautiful those flowers are, y'all. That is a gorgeous basil plant. There's more right there, just everywhere. You can see the bees all over them. All of these basils are Thai basils. Doing fantastic, bringing in not just the bees, but check it out, ladybugs and all that. Doing good. Now again, that cardinal basil I grew from seed and did the exact same way I just explained how to plant basil seeds, or how I've always planted basil seeds. And you can see how good they're doing. Now, one fun fact about basil, this is pretty much a fact for a lot of the herbs that I've done these videos on, but basil for sure, is once you let them go to flower, they start producing seeds and they start dropping their seeds, you will never have to buy basil again. Now, you're gonna have a lot of basil, as I have a bee hovering around me. You will have a lot of basil. Now, basil is really easy to transplant. Just dig up the little root ball that's attached to the stem, to the plant, and transplant it around your garden. That is literally how all the basil in this garden has been done. I have not bought basil, y'all, honestly, 3 years. Once you plant basil and it goes to flower, I'm telling y'all, you're not gonna have to buy basil anymore. It is a great plant for that reason. You want to start harvesting when the plants are 6 to 8 inches tall. You do not want to harvest everything off of the plant though. That's why you need multiple plants if you're going to harvest and grow these for harvesting for the kitchen. Make sure you have plenty of plants. You don't want to kill the plant or shock the plant. And it's more as it continues to grow, as the plants continue to get bigger, you can harvest more and more from the plants. But I always say take about a third if you're going to harvest from one plant, no more than a third off your plant. You do not want to send the plant into shock or to die. So, and then just take them in the kitchen, use them how you're going to use them. But remember, if you're going to be harvesting, make sure that those plants that you're harvesting from do not bolt. You do not want them flowering because, again, the leaves will turn bitter. Who wants bitter pesto? Okay, let's talk about my favorite reason for growing basil, and that's the companion planting side of basil. If you're new to gardening or you've never actually companion planted, let me ask you this. When you grow your tomatoes, do you have hornworms, tomato hornworms? If you do, then my question is, why aren't you planting basil? Basil and tomatoes go together like peanut butter and jelly in the garden. The smell or the aroma from your basil plants are so strong, they will confuse insects that use smell as their way of honing in to plants to lay their eggs on, which is what the hawk moth does. And the hawk moth is the moth that brings in the tomato hornworm. Now, I mentioned earlier in the springtime, in that tomato bed, I had about 30 tomato plants in that bed. And I have basil everywhere over there. I did not have a single hornworm at all in that bed. Now, at the exact same time, I had one tomato plant growing right over there in a pot all by itself away from the basil as a test. I wanted to see if the hawk moth, because I know they're out here, would see the 30 plants or only find the one plant growing by itself. Y'all, I've had one hornworm in this garden for the last 2 years, and it was on that one plant over there by itself. So literally, I had a hawk moth flying around this garden, could not find the 30 tomato plants because they were surrounded by basil. But the moth did find the one tomato plant that was completely exposed. So, if you think companion planting doesn't work, I'm telling you right now, for basil and tomatoes, it absolutely works. Try it next year. Plant as much basil as you can, let them go to flower, and protect your tomatoes. Tomatoes aren't the only plants that they'll protect. I'm going to go down a list because there's a lot. And I didn't even write down all of them because there are so many plants that basil helps keep away bad pests or brings in the pollinators. So I'm going to read down this list, y'all. It's a lot. So right off the bat, I already said tomatoes, marigolds, carrots, peppers, eggplants. So basically and literally all of the nightshade family, all of the brassica family, which are cabbages, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, all of them. Garlic, cilantro, cucumbers, dill, asparagus, fennel, nasturtiums. There are a ton of plants that basil will benefit if you plant basil next to those plants. Now, on the flip side, these are the insects, the beneficial insects that planting basil and letting it go to flower will bring in. Bees, of course. All pollinators, let's just say that, all pollinators, including butterflies. Very important to bring in all of the pollinators to your garden. And lacewings. Now, why are lacewings important? Because they eat bad pests. So you're not only bringing in pollinators, you're bringing in beneficial insects that will help naturally take care of your bad pests, the pests that affect everything. So let me read down the list of the bad pests that planting basil helps deter, whether from bringing in natural enemies or literally just deter. Okay, carrot flies, tomato hornworms, already explained that. Mosquitoes, we'll get into that one in just a second. White flies, regular flies, bean and Japanese beetles, and cabbage worms. You don't want cabbage worms on your cabbage, so have basil near your cabbage, which is a brassica, which I already mentioned. Now, I said mosquitoes. Now, as I'm sitting here right now, I've got mosquitoes around me, and I have basil literally, y'all, right here. But when the internet says, hey, just plant basil and you won't have mosquitoes, well, that's not true. It's certain types of basil that deter and repel mosquitoes, and those are the following: lemon, cinnamon, and Peruvian basil. Those three basils are so potent in their smell that they help push away or deter mosquitoes. So if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot or your nursery and they've got some sweet basil that you've used for pestos and you plant it and you're thinking, man, I'm not going to get bit by a single mosquito, you're wrong. Sorry. I've got those all around me. Sweet basil's right there. Thai basil's right here. And I literally just got bit on the hand while we're filming. So you want to have the right types of basil. And y'all, I've said this from the beginning. I've been growing basil for 4 years, and this is the first time that I did a deep internet dive into researching this plant to find out that lemon, cinnamon, and Peruvian basils help deter mosquitoes. So spring of 2025, those three types of basil will also be out here in this garden, I guarantee. All right, y'all, that's everything that a beginner would need to know about growing basil and the benefits of having basil in your garden. Again, even if you're not going to grow it for culinary purposes, grow it anyway and let it go to flower. Everyone, if y'all enjoyed this video, if you got anything out of it, if you learned anything, do me the 3 favors: share, like, and subscribe to this channel if you've not done so already. If you're a beginner gardener, do you want to watch a channel from a basically beginner gardener who's going to show you all the things that goes on in the garden, the good, the bad, and the in between, the failures and the successes? If so, click that subscribe button and join this growing community here on YouTube. Everyone take care, God bless, continue to shine bright and harvest hard, and I hope you grow basil next year, either just for the pollinators and the beneficial insects, the culinary, or a little bit of both. Talk to y'all again real soon. Bye.